Hello everyone, thank you for clicking on this video. Dim the lights that surround you, quiet the persistent noise of the modern age. We are about to take an inner journey, descending not just into the past, but deep into the earth itself, to an era of crushing trial and the quiet, desperate endurance of souls forgotten by the sun. For these next moments, let go of the name you carry, the air you breathe, the very identity that defines you now. We will borrow another existence, inhabit a life etched in salt and shadow, a story not of ruler splendor, but of silent, unrecorded traces left in the darkness. This age we enter is one of stark contrast, where the weight of absolute power feels as heavy as the mountain above, and hope, if it exists at all, is often but the faintest glimmer in an eternal subterranean night. We are bound for the salt mines of the Middle Ages. Close your eyes, let the world you inhabit recede, the sounds of your present life soften into silence. Feel instead the raw, biting wind of a desolate plateau, a place forgotten by mercy. The ground beneath your bare feet is not soil, but a carpet of sharp stone chips and gritty dust. Open your inner eye to a vast weeping wound in the earth, a quarry, bleached bone white under a sky that offers no comfort, only an endless, glaring expanse. You are here. This is your reality. Your name is a forgotten whisper, your past a stolen dream. You are a body, a pair of hands, a tool for the breaking of stone. The day begins not with the gentle kiss of dawn, but with the shriek of a raw horn, or the brutal clang of iron on iron, a summons that rips through the thin veil of your exhausted slumber. Every muscle, every joint, every fibre of your being screams in protest as you force yourself upright from the cold, unforgiving earth that served as your bed. The air is already thick with the fine, pervasive dust that is the quarry's signature. It coats your tongue, lines your throat, and stings your eyes. It is the first taste of the morning, and it will be the last taste of the night. There is no time for reflection, no moment to gather the scattered fragments of your spirit. You are herded, along with the other shadowy figures that share your fate, towards the rock face that looms like a malevolent god. The rags that cling to your emaciated frame offer scant protection against the morning chill, or later, against the relentless sun. Your world has shrunk to this, the feel of a heavy mallet or a cold chisel in your raw, calloused hands, the sight of the unyielding stone before you, the sound of the overseer's lash cracking like a thunderbolt nearby, the gnawing emptiness in your belly. You were someone, once. You had a life, perhaps a family, hopes, fears that were your own. That person is a ghost now, a faint echo in the hollow chambers of your memory. The quarry has stripped you bare, layer by layer, until only the most primal instincts remain, to work, to eat what little is given, to avoid the whip, to somehow survive another day in this sun-scorched, soul-crushing amphitheatre of despair. Freedom is a word too luxurious to even form in your thoughts. It belongs to another universe, one you can no longer reach. Your home, if the wretched collection of crude lean-tos or shallow crevices in the rock where you collapse at night can be called such, is no better than an animal pen. It reeks of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, festering wounds, and the ever-present dust that even there finds no respite. You share this misery with countless others, their coughs and groans a constant, mournful chorus in the darkness. But now, under the pitiless gaze of the awakening sky, that brief, squalid intermission is over. The quarry demands its due. You are assigned your task, often the same grueling labor as the day before, and the day before that. Perhaps you are part of a team that drills holes into the massive rock face, with heavy iron bits and sledgehammers, the rhythmic, jarring impact vibrating through your bones until your teeth ache and your vision blurs. Or maybe you are one of those who wields the smaller chisels and hammers, shaping the roughly hewn blocks, your world narrowed to the few inches of stone before you, the dust rising in a choking cloud with every precise, desperate blow. Others, the haulers, are yoked like oxen to crude sledges, or forced to carry impossibly heavy loads of dressed stone on their backs, their spines curving, their muscles tearing, their feet bleeding onto the sharp, uneven ground. The sun climbs, a malevolent eye in the vast, indifferent sky, and the heat becomes a physical torment. The rock itself radiates a fierce, oven-like warmth, and the dust motes dance in the shimmering air. Sweat pours from you, stinging your eyes, carving clean rivulets through the layers of grime on your skin, only to be instantly caked with fresh dust. The overseers stalk the edges of the work gangs, their shadows long and menacing, their whips a constant silent threat. A moment's hesitation, a misstep, a sign of faltering, and the lash will fall, a fiery serpent that bites deep and leaves a burning wheal as a reminder of your place in this brutal order. Your body is a screaming testament to this existence, hands gnarled and bleeding, back a landscape of unending pain, lungs laboring to draw breath in the suffocating dust. And the day has barely begun. The sun, your tormentor, climbs higher, each degree it ascends, stripping away another layer of your already depleted reserves. There is a rhythm to the work, a terrible soul-crushing cadence set by the thud of hammers, the grate of chisels, and the strained grunts of men pushed beyond their limits. You fall into this rhythm, not by choice, but by a grim necessity. To fight it is to exhaust yourself faster. To fall out of step is to invite the immediate, brutal attention of the whip. So you move, a ghost in a machine of suffering, your consciousness narrowed to the immediate task, the next swing, the next lift, the next agonizing step. The dust is a constant companion, a third skin. It cakes your eyelashes, turns your saliva into a gritty paste, and lines your lungs with a suffocating film. Sometimes, a gust of wind, hot and dry as a furnace blast, will swirl it into choking clouds, forcing all work to a momentary gasping halt. But these respites are brief, and the overseers are quick to drive you back to your labors, their voices impatient and harsh. You learn to breathe shallowly, to turn your head away from the worst of it, small, instinctive adaptations in a world designed to break you. Hours crawl by with agonizing slowness, each one an eternity carved out of stone and suffering. Your muscles burn with a relentless fire, first screaming in protest, then subsiding into a dull, throbbing ache that becomes as familiar as your own heartbeat. Your hands, if you could bear to look at them, are a mess of raw blisters, torn calluses, and embedded grit, the skin split and bleeding around your broken fingernails. Every impact of the tool sends shivers of pain up your arms, yet you continue, for to stop is to risk a pain far sharper, far more deliberate. Thirst becomes a maddening obsession. Your tongue feels thick and swollen, your throat a parched desert. You dream of water, cool and clean, a stark contrast to the tepid, often brackish liquid that might, if you are fortunate, be doled out in meager rations later. Sometimes, to escape the unendurable present, your mind retreats. You might find yourself counting the number of hammer blows to split a certain type of rock, the number of paces to haul a load from one point to another. It's a futile exercise in imposing order on chaos, a way to mark the passage of time when the sun's relentless journey across the sky seems to mock your efforts. Or perhaps a memory, unbidden and unwelcome, will surface the cool shade of a tree from your forgotten life, the taste of a particular fruit, the sound of a loved one's laughter. These memories are daggers, each one a fresh stab of loss, yet you cling to them, for they are the only proof that you were once more than this suffering automaton. You observe your fellow prisoners, their faces masks of dust and despair, their bodies moving with the same weary-driven motions. There is little communication beyond a shared grunt of exertion, or a warning glance if an overseer approaches. Solidarity is a dangerous luxury. Too much camaraderie can be seen as a threat. Yet, sometimes, a silent understanding passes between you, a shared moment of eye contact that acknowledges the common hell, a fleeting recognition that you are not entirely alone in this desolate expanse of human misery. The midday break, when it finally arrives, is a brief, brutal affair. You collapse onto the hot, dusty ground, your body trembling with exhaustion. A hunk of coarse, dark bread, perhaps a small ladle of thin, watery gruel, is thrust at you. It is gone in moments, swallowed with a desperate hunger that it barely begins to appease. There is no pleasure in this food, only the animalistic drive to refuel for the torment that is to resume all too soon. The overseers watch, their expressions contemptuous, ensuring the break is no longer than the absolute minimum required to keep you functioning. And then the horn sounds again, or the whips crack, and you are driven back to the rock face, back to the dust, back to the searing heat and the unending ache. The afternoon stretches before you, a mirror image of the morning's agony, a slow descent towards a night that will offer little relief, only a temporary pause before the cycle begins anew. The afternoon stretches before you, a mirror image of the morning's agony, a slow descent towards a night that will offer little relief, only a temporary pause before the cycle begins anew. The sun, having reached its zenith, now begins its slow, taunting crawl towards the western rim of the quarry, but its heat lingers, trapped by the towering rock walls, baking you in a kiln of dust and despair. Your movements become more leaden, your coordination falters, the heavy mallet feels as though it weighs 1,000 stones, each swing an act of monumental will. Mistakes become more frequent now, a misplaced blow, a fumbled grip, a stumble on the treacherous footing, and mistakes are met with swift, brutal punishment. The overseers, perhaps weary themselves, seem to possess a heightened cruelty in these waning hours, their tempers shorter, their lashes quicker, as if trying to wring the last dregs of productivity from your failing bodies. You see men around you succumbing to the relentless pressure. Some simply collapse, their bodies giving out to be dragged away with callous indifference, their fate uncertain, though unlikely to be pleasant. Others work on in a daze, their eyes vacant, their movements purely mechanical, their spirits seemingly having already fled their tormented flesh. You fight against this tide of utter exhaustion, focusing on the smallest of things, the grain in the rock before you, the rhythm of your own ragged breathing, the way the shadow of a distant crag slowly lengthens across the quarry floor. These tiny points of focus are anchors, however fragile, against the overwhelming desire to simply let go, to fall into the inviting darkness of unconsciousness. Finally, as the sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood red and bruised purple, colors that seem to mock the muted grey and brown of your wretched existence, a horn, different in tone from the morning summons, signals the end of the day's labor. It is not a sound of liberation, merely a temporary reprieve. A collective groan, almost inaudible, seems to rise from the assembled workers. Tools are dropped where they lie, the clang of metal on stone now echoing with finality rather than demand. The trudge back to your squalid shelters is a silent procession of ghosts. Each step is an effort, your legs trembling, your back a column of fire. The dust you've inhaled all day forms a thick phlegm in your throat, and a chorus of hacking coughs accompanies your weary march. The air, cooling slightly as darkness falls, carries the scent of your collective misery, stale sweat, dried blood, and the ever-present cloying dust. If there is an evening ration, it is little better than what you received at midday. More coarse bread, perhaps another ladle of watery soup, consumed in the growing darkness, surrounded by the sighs and whimpers of your fellow sufferers. You eat it slowly, not out of any enjoyment, but because your body is too exhausted for the frantic wolfing of the midday meal. Every muscle throbs, every joint aches. The fine cuts and abrasions on your hands and arms, ignored during the desperate intensity of work, now flare with a burning, persistent pain. You crawl into your designated patch of cold earth, or uneven rock within the crowded lean-to. There is no comfort here. The ground is hard, the air thick with the stench of too many bodies pressed too close. As you lie there, a profound weariness settles over you, a weight that seems to crush you into the very stone. Yet, sleep is often elusive. The pain in your body, now that it is no longer masked by the demands of labor, makes itself known with a vengeance. Every twitch, every shift of position, sends fresh waves of agony through your limbs. The chorus of coughs, groans, and muttered nightmares from those around you provides a constant dismal soundtrack. You might stare up into the impenetrable darkness of your shelter, or, if positioned near an opening, at the distant cold stars that seem to observe your suffering with serene indifference. Fleeting images of the day's toil, of the overseer's snarling face, of a falling rock, might drift through your mind. The dread of the coming dawn, of the inevitable horn that will signal the resumption of your torment, is a cold knot in the pit of your stomach. Eventually, sheer exhaustion might claim you, dragging you down into a shallow, dream-haunted stupor that is less rest than a brief cessation of consciousness before the cycle begins again. Eventually, sheer exhaustion might claim you, dragging you down into a shallow, dream-haunted stupor that is less rest than a brief cessation of consciousness before the cycle begins again. And begin it does, with the same brutal summons, the same aching dread, the same descent into the sun-baked, dust-choked hell of the quarry. Days bleed into weeks, weeks into months, and months into seasons that mark their passage only by subtle shifts in the nature of your suffering. The biting winds and numbing cold of winter give way to the rains of spring that turn the quarry floor into a treacherous mire, followed by the merciless, baking heat of summer, and then the slow, chilling descent into autumn once more. You lose count. Time becomes a thick, undifferentiated river of toil, punctuated only by the raw throb of your abused body and the gnawing emptiness in your stomach. The quarry itself changes, a slow, agonizing scarification of the land. Faces of rock you once knew, where every handhold and fissure was intimately familiar, are carved away, replaced by new, unfamiliar depths. The piles of waste rock grow into small mountains themselves, monuments to your collective, futile labor. You see the landscape of your imprisonment evolve, but your own condition remains static in its misery, or perhaps subtly deteriorates with each passing year. Your body, once merely aching, now feels like a crumbling edifice. Old injuries flare with new intensity, joints grind and pop with every movement. The dust, inhaled over uncounted seasons, has settled deep within your lungs, a permanent heaviness, a constant companion that announces its presence with a racking cough that tears at your insides, especially in the cold stillness of the night. Your skin is a roadmap of suffering, leathery and scarred, stretched taut over bones that seem to grow more prominent with each passing year. You see this same decay in the others who have endured as long as you, their bodies bent and gnarled, their faces masks of ancient, weary resignation. New arrivals, still carrying the ghost of their former lives in their eyes, look upon you old ones with a mixture of pity and a dawning, horrified understanding of their own future. What happens to the mind in such a place, over such a span of time? Memories of the world before the quarry, once sharp and agonizing, begin to fade, their colors dimming, their edges blurring. They become like tales told by a stranger, their emotional charge lessened by the sheer, overwhelming weight of your present reality. Sometimes you struggle to recall the face of a loved one, or the sound of your own true name, and a cold tendril of fear grips you, the fear of becoming entirely hollow, a mere shell animated by the overseer's will. To combat this erosion, you might develop small, secret rituals. You might scratch a barely perceptible mark on a hidden stone for each passing moon, a futile attempt to keep track of the stolen years. Or you might focus with an almost religious intensity on the tiniest details of your work, the precise angle of a chisel, the exact sound of a perfectly struck blow, not out of any pride in the labor, but as a way to anchor your consciousness, to keep it from dissolving into the grey monotony. You learn to observe the non-human life that ekes out an existence even in this desolate place, a stubborn weed pushing through a crack in a rock, an insect scuttling across the dusty ground, the distant circling of a hawk high above. These tiny lives, so fragile yet so persistent, sometimes offer a strange, unspoken companionship, a reminder that life, in some form, endures even in the face of overwhelming desolation. Fear, too, changes its nature. The sharp, heart-pounding terror of your early days has mostly subsided, replaced by a dull, constant apprehension, a low thrum of anxiety that underlies every waking moment. You know the rules of this brutal game, the boundaries, the consequences, yet the capacity for unexpected cruelty from the overseers, or the ever-present danger of the quarry itself, a loose rock, a snapping rope, a moment of another's carelessness, means that true peace, even the peace of utter resignation, is never fully attainable. You live on a knife's edge, and the only certainty is the pain of today and the promise of more pain tomorrow. You live on a knife's edge, and the only certainty is the pain of today and the promise of more pain tomorrow. What then, of hope? The word itself feels like a foreign currency, something of value in a world you no longer inhabit, but useless here in the dust and despair of the quarry. Hope as you once understood it, for a better future, for rescue, for a return to a life of meaning. That hope died long ago, a quiet, unmourned casualty of relentless suffering. To cling to such grand illusions would be a madness, an invitation for disappointment, so profound it could shatter the fragile shell of endurance you've built around your core. Yet, does something else take its place? Perhaps not hope, but a kind of stubborn, animalistic will. The will to draw one more breath, to take one more step, to see the sun rise, however balefully, one more time. It is not directed towards any discernible future, but is rooted fiercely in the present, in the raw act of being, despite everything. And sometimes, in the deepest recesses of your weary mind, tiny, almost imperceptible desires flicker, not for freedom, but for the briefest alleviation of suffering. The desire for a day with no whipping, the desire for a slightly larger portion of bread, one that doesn't taste entirely of mold, the desire for a night where the cold doesn't seep so deeply into your bones, or where your aching body allows a few moments of true, dreamless sleep. These are not hopes that sustain, they are merely faint preferences, whispers of a self that still somehow differentiates between degrees of misery. Freedom, the concept, when it occasionally drifts into your consciousness, perhaps triggered by the sight of a bird taking flight, or the arrival of new prisoners who still speak of an outside world, feels utterly abstract. It is like trying to imagine a color you have never seen. What would it even mean to not feel the overseer's gaze on your back, to not wake to the clang of the summons, to choose what to do with your own hands, your own time? The idea is so vast, so alien, that it inspires not yearning, but a kind of bewildered emptiness. Your cage, though made of rock and fear, has become the only world you truly know. The thought of existing outside it is almost as terrifying as remaining within it. For who would you be without the quarry to define your every moment? Your dreams, when they come, are rarely pleasant. Often they are a chaotic replay of the day's toil, endless stone, the weight of the hammer, the overseer's snarling face, the sensation of falling. Sometimes fragments of your old life intrude, vivid and achingly real, the face of a loved one, the warmth of a hearth, only to dissolve upon waking, leaving you with an even more profound sense of loss and desolation. There are no dreams of escape, no heroic fantasies. Your subconscious, it seems, is as broken and confined as your waking life. Yet, even here, in this landscape of despair, tiny, almost invisible acts of solidarity might occur, so subtle they are barely recordable. A quicker hand that steadies a loose stone before it falls on another's foot. A shared piece of scavenged root passed silently in the darkness of the hovel. A low, wordless hum that briefly harmonizes with another's. A sound almost lost beneath the chorus of coughs. A fleeting, shared acknowledgement of a common humanity. A reminder that even here, you are not entirely alone in your suffering. These moments are rare, like finding a drop of clean water in a desert of dust. Betrayals also happen, born of desperation, when one man seeks to lessen his own suffering at the expense of another. But the small, unspoken kindnesses, when they appear, are what you choose to hold on to, if only in the fading light of memory. They are the cracks where the faintest light of what it once meant to be human still seeps through. They are the cracks where the faintest light of what it once meant to be human still seeps through. And it is perhaps these infinitesimally small things, the shared glance, the unspoken kindness, the stubborn wildflower, the half-forgotten taste of rain, that prevent your spirit from being entirely ground into the same anonymous dust as the stones you quarry. These are not grand acts of rebellion, not defiant shouts against an uncaring sky. They are the quiet, almost imperceptible ways in which life, even in its most brutalized and constrained form, asserts its presence, its refusal to be wholly extinguished. You have seen the quarry devour generations. You have watched as strong bodies withered and sharp minds dulled under the relentless grinding pressure. You have walked over the earth that covers countless unnamed, unmourned dead, and you have endured. What is the nature of this endurance? It is not born of courage, for courage implies a choice, a battle against a foe one might overcome. This is something more elemental, more akin to the stone itself, a capacity to bear immense crushing weight, to erode slowly, imperceptibly, yet to remain. It is the resilience of the weed that forces its way through pavement, the tenacity of the lichen that clings to the barest rock. There will be no bards to sing of your deeds, for your deeds are merely the endless repetition of toil. No scholars will record your name, for your name was stolen from you along with your freedom. The magnificent castles, the soaring cathedrals, the mighty fortifications that will rise from the stones you have bled over will stand as monuments to kings and bishops, to architects and master builders. Their names will be lauded, their achievements celebrated. But beneath the gleaming facades, beneath the carved inscriptions, lies your story, and the story of countless others like you, a silent, invisible foundation of sweat and blood and bone. You are the unseen hands that shaped the visible world. Your suffering is the dark soil from which their glories grew. This knowledge, if it can be called that, offers no comfort, no solace. It is merely a stark, unadorned truth, perceived with the clarity that only prolonged, intimate acquaintance with despair can bring. You will leave no personal trace, no monument to your individual existence. Your legacy is etched not in stone that bears your name, but in the very act of your survival, in the stubborn refusal of your spirit to be completely annihilated. And so, as another day of torment draws to its inevitable close, as you drag your aching body back to the squalor that passes for shelter, as you swallow your meager ration and prepare for another night of broken rest, something within you, that hard, indomitable core forged in the crucible of this quarry, remains. It is the quiet dignity of endurance, the profound, unspoken statement of a life that, despite being stripped of all that makes life conventionally meaningful, still clung to the act of living. The stars, when you glimpse them through a crack in the hovel roof, are the same stars that shone on your ancestors, and the same stars that will shine on generations yet to come. They are distant, cold, and indifferent to your plight. Yet, in their silent, unwavering presence, there is perhaps a reflection of your own enduring, unyielding existence. You are a particle of dust in an indifferent universe, a forgotten soul in a brutal age. But you are here, you have lived. And in that simple, terrible, and profoundly human fact lies the entirety of your unwritten, unforgettable story. The perpetual hum of Corzin was the first thing Ilara registered each morning, even before the relentless sun found its way through the intricately carved wooden shutters of her rented room. It was a city that never truly slept, a vibrant, pulsating heart along the vast artery of the Silk Road. Dust, finer than any she had known in the quiet libraries of her homeland, carried the scent of exotic spices, cardamom, saffron, cumin, mingled with the earthier aromas of pack animals, dyed wool, and the smoke from countless cooking fires. This was Corzin, a city of 1,000 tongues and 1,000,000 secrets, and somewhere within its labyrinthine embrace lay the prize she sought. Ilara traced the faded embroidery on the silk pouch that lay beside her meagre breakfast of dates and flatbread. Inside, nestled amongst protective layers of oiled cloth, was her only true map, not of Corzan's bewildering alleyways, but of fragmented clues, half-forgotten references, and the desperate hope of a scholar obsessed. She was searching for the Ethelberg treatises, a collection of manuscripts rumoured to contain astronomical knowledge and philosophical insights from a school of thought long since declared heretical and systematically erased from the grand annals of the Western academies. To find them would be more than a scholarly triumph. It would be to resurrect a silenced voice, to restore a lost limb to the body of human understanding. Her life in Corzan was a careful dance of observation and discretion. A woman travelling alone, even one who dressed in the modest, flowing robes of a desert traveller and kept her gaze lowered, attracted attention. She had learned to navigate the teeming bazaars with a quiet confidence she didn't always feel, her senses alive to the cacophony of bartering merchants, the cries of water sellers, the melodic calls to prayer, and the underlying currents of a city built on trade, and whispered information. Her inquiries had to be subtle, veiled in casual conversation with parchment sellers, antiquarians, and the occasional wizened storyteller who might hold a sliver of forgotten lore. Today, her search would take her to the old quarter, to the rumoured remnants of what was once a famed scriptorium, now supposedly a collection of dilapidated storerooms and dusty artisan workshops. The clues, pieced together from a coded reference in a marginal note of a text she'd studied for years, were tenuous at best. But Alara was fueled by a scholar's tenacity, a relentless curiosity that had already carried her across treacherous mountains and parched deserts. She secured her precious pouch within the folds of her robe, her heart a familiar mix of trepidation and excitement. The streets, as she stepped out, were already a river of humanity. Merchants shouted their wares, their stalls overflowing with vibrant silks, gleaming metalwork, fragrant teas, and intricately patterned carpets. Camels, laden with goods from distant empires, grumbled their protests, their bells adding a dissonant chime to the city's orchestra. The air was thick, alive, a sensory tapestry that both invigorated and overwhelmed. Alara moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar architecture, seeking out the landmarks mentioned in her cryptic notes. The sun beat down, reflecting off the pale adobe walls, and the dust, as always, was her constant companion, settling on her dark hair and eyelashes. She knew the risks. Khorzan, for all its vibrant energy, was also a place of shadows, where knowledge could be a dangerous commodity, and where those who sought lost things might themselves become lost. But the lure of the Athelberg treatises, the promise of discovery, was a flame that burned too brightly within her to be extinguished by fear. Her quest had brought her to the heart of the Silk Road, and Khorzan, she felt with a scholar's intuition, was ready to yield one of its many secrets. Her quest had brought her to the heart of the Silk Road, and Khorzan, she felt with a scholar's intuition, was ready to yield one of its many secrets. The old quarter, when she finally reached its periphery, felt like stepping back further in time. The bustling energy of the main thoroughfares gave way to narrower, winding alleyways, the buildings pressing closer together, their upper stories often leaning precariously over the shaded paths below. The scent of spices and commerce was fainter here, replaced by the aroma of old wood, damp stone, and the subtle, almost metallic tang of ancient dust. Fewer merchants plied their trade. Instead, artisans worked in dimly lit doorways, a coppersmith hammering a delicate pattern, a weaver at a complex loom, an old man meticulously repairing a leather-bound book. Alara clutched the small, smooth stone she carried in her pocket, a habit from her childhood, a small comfort in moments of uncertainty. The directions from her fragmented notes were harder to decipher here, where alleys split and rejoined with no apparent logic, and doorways seemed to appear and disappear with the shifting shadows. She paused at a small, sun-drenched square where a few children played with a worn leather ball, their laughter a bright, incongruous sound in the otherwise quiet district. An elderly woman, her face a tapestry of wrinkles, watched them from a shaded alcove, her dark eyes missing nothing. Alara offered a respectful nod, which was met with a slow, deliberate blink. According to her research, the scriptorium of Al-Kindi had once been a beacon of learning, its scholars renowned for their translations and original works. But that was centuries ago. Dynasties had fallen, trade routes had shifted, and Khorzan itself had weathered sieges and neglect. What remained now, her notes suggested, was likely a ruin, its purpose forgotten, its treasures, if any survived, buried under layers of indifference and decay. She found what she believed was the location, a crumbling archway, half hidden behind a collapsing wall, draped with tenacious desert vines, leading into a shadowed courtyard. The air within felt cooler, still. Unlike the bustling artisan shops nearby, this place seemed deserted. Piles of rubble lay in corners, and the remnants of what might have once been a fountain, a cracked stone basin filled with dry leaves, sat in the center. Several low, stone buildings, their wooden doors either missing or hanging askew on rusted hinges, surrounded the courtyard. This, then, was the ghost of the scriptorium. A flicker of apprehension mixed with the scholar's thrill. This was not a place that invited casual visitors. She took a slow breath, her senses on high alert. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the distant cooing of pigeons and the scuttling of some unseen creature in the debris. She chose the largest of the buildings, its doorway a dark, uninviting maw. "Is anyone here?" she called out, her voice sounding small and uncertain in the stillness. No reply. Stepping inside, she found herself in a cavernous space. What little light filtered through a few high, narrow windows, caked with centuries of grime, revealed stone walls lined with empty niches and alcoves. Dust lay thick as a shroud over everything. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and something else, an old, dry, papery smell that made her heart quicken. It was the scent of forgotten books, of decaying parchment. She moved deeper into the gloom, her footsteps echoing eerily. Cobwebs, thick as curtains, brushed against her face. Her eyes, slowly adjusting, began to make out shapes. Broken shelves, overturned lecterns, a few scattered, tattered remnants of what might have once been scrolls or bindings, too far gone to salvage. Disappointment, sharp and cold, began to prick at her. Had she come all this way, risked so much, for nothing but dust and decay? Then, in the far corner, half hidden behind a fallen section of the roof, she saw it, a heavy, dark wooden chest, bound with tarnished metal bands. It was out of place amongst the general ruin, as if deliberately concealed, or simply more robust than its surroundings. Her breath caught. This was different. This felt intentional. Her breath caught. This was different. This felt intentional. Forgetting for a moment the oppressive dust and the eerie silence, Elara moved towards the chest with a renewed sense of purpose, her weariness momentarily forgotten. It was larger than she had first thought, crafted from some dark, resilient wood that had largely resisted the decay affecting everything else in the room. The metal bands were indeed tarnished, but not deeply corroded, and a heavy, ornate lock, green with verdigris, secured its lid. She knelt beside it, her fingers tracing the intricate, unfamiliar patterns carved into the wood, her heart hammered against her ribs. Could this be it? After all these years of searching, all the perilous travel, could the lost Athelberg treatises lie within arm's reach, hidden away in this forgotten corner of a forgotten city? Or was it merely another dead end, a repository for something mundane, its promise as empty as the niches in the walls? She ran her hands over the lock. It was clearly beyond her ability to pick without tools, and any attempt to force it would likely damage the chest, and perhaps its precious contents. Frustration welled up, sharp and immediate. To be so close, yet still so far. Looking around the gloomy chamber, her eyes scanned the debris for anything that might serve as a lever or a tool. Her gaze fell upon a sturdy-looking iron bar, perhaps once part of a window grating, lying amidst a pile of fallen masonry. It was heavy, but she managed to drag it over to the chest. With cautious effort, she tried to wedge it beneath the lid, near the lock, but the wood was too thick, the fit too tight. She risked splintering the chest to no avail. A sigh of exasperation escaped her. She sat back on her heels, the dust rising around her in a small cloud. She was a scholar, not a thief or a treasure hunter. Her skills lay in deciphering ancient texts, not in breaking into locked coffers. Then, as her eyes roved over the chest again, more slowly this time, she noticed something she'd missed in her initial excitement. Near the bottom, on one of the side panels, was a small, almost invisible indentation, no larger than her thumbprint. It was so subtle, so blended with the carved patterns, that it could easily have been overlooked. Her pulse quickened again. It didn't look like damage. It looked like a deliberate design feature. With trembling fingers, she pressed the indentation. For a moment, nothing happened. Disappointment began to creep back. Then she felt a faint click, a subtle shift within the chest's structure, almost too quiet to hear in the profound silence of the ruined scriptorium. She pressed again, harder this time, and heard a soft, dry rasp, as if an internal mechanism, long dormant, was grudgingly stirring to life. Holding her breath, she carefully tried the lid. It was still heavy, but the resistance from the main lock seemed to have lessened. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, she heaved upwards. The lid, with a groan of ancient wood and a screech of protesting metal, lifted perhaps an inch. It wasn't fully open, but it was enough. Peering into the narrow gap, the dim light from the high windows was insufficient. She fumbled in the pouch at her belt, her fingers finding the small tinderbox and the stub of a candle she always carried for such scholarly emergencies. It took several tries with shaking hands, the scrape of flint on steel echoing loudly in the stillness, but finally a tiny flame sputtered to life. Shielding it carefully, she brought the candle closer to the opening. The first thing she saw was the glint of aged, yellowed parchment, bound not in grand leather tomes, but in simple protective rolls, tied with what looked like faded silk ribbons. They were packed tightly, filling the chest, and on the uppermost scroll, visible even in the flickering candlelight, was a script she recognized, an archaic form of the language she had studied for years, a script associated with the very period and school of thought from which the Ethelberg treatises were said to have originated. Her vision blurred, not from the dust or the dim light, but from the sudden, overwhelming surge of emotion. It couldn't be, could it? Her vision blurred, not from the dust or the dim light, but from the sudden, overwhelming surge of emotion. It couldn't be, could it? Years of relentless study, of chasing phantom references across continents, of enduring skepticism and solitude, all of it had led to this moment, in this forgotten, crumbling chamber. With hands that trembled so violently, she could barely control them. Alara carefully maneuvered the candle to get a better view, then reached into the narrow opening. Her fingers brushed against the dry, slightly brittle edge of the topmost scroll. It felt impossibly ancient, yet strangely preserved in the dry, still air of the chest. She managed to grasp it, her touch infinitely gentle, and slowly, painstakingly, began to draw it out. The scroll resisted for a moment, then slid free with a soft, whispering sigh of parchment, unrolling ever so slightly. She laid it on the dusty lid of the chest, the candlelight dancing over its surface. The silk ribbon that bound it was indeed faded, but intact. With a reverence bordering on worship, she carefully untied the delicate knot. The parchment crackled softly as she began to unroll the first few inches. The script was undeniably archaic, the ink faded, but still legible. Her eyes, trained by years of poring over similar texts, scanned the opening lines. A title, penned in a slightly larger, more ornate hand, swam into focus: De motus fararum coelestium, liber primus. On the motion of the celestial spheres, Book 1. A choked sob escaped Alara's lips. It was undeniably part of the Ethelberg cycle. This was not just a lost text. This was the legendary astronomical treatise, the one rumoured to contain observations and calculations that predated and perhaps even surpassed the accepted masters. Her mind reeled, the implications were staggering. She unrolled a little more, her gaze devouring the dense script. Intricate diagrams, penned with an astonishing precision, illustrated the text. Charts of constellations she recognized, but with subtle, significant differences from the standard representations, calculations that hinted at a cosmological model far more complex and elegant than anything she had ever encountered. This was not just a copy. The quality of the parchment, the style of the script, the very feel of it suggested an original, or at least a very early, meticulously crafted version. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the ancient words. They were not tears of sorrow, but of an almost unbearable joy, of profound relief, of a scholar's ultimate vindication. She had found it. Against all odds, against all reason, she had found it. For a long moment, she could only stare, her hand resting protectively on the fragile parchment, the candlelight casting a warm glow on her tear-streaked face. The silence of the scriptorium seemed to press in around her, amplifying the sound of her own ragged breathing and the thunderous beating of her heart. The weight of centuries, the echoes of forgotten voices, seemed to fill the dusty air. Then, a sudden, sharp creak from somewhere outside the chamber, the sound of a heavy footstep on loose rubble, shattered the spell. Alara froze, her blood turning to ice. The joy vanished, instantly replaced by a primal surge of fear. She was not alone. Someone else was in the courtyard, or perhaps even closer. Had she been followed? Did someone know what she had found, or what she was seeking? Her mind raced. The scrolls, these priceless, irreplaceable treasures, were exposed. She was vulnerable, a lone woman in a ruined, deserted building, with a discovery that many would kill for, either for its knowledge or for the power it represented. The flickering candlelight, which moments ago had illuminated a miracle, now seemed to cast treacherous, revealing shadows. The flickering candlelight, which moments ago had illuminated a miracle, now seemed to cast treacherous, revealing shadows, highlighting her presence in the desolate chamber. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at Alara's throat. Her first instinct was to protect the scrolls. With frantic, trembling hands, she hastily tried to re-roll the one she had been examining, the ancient parchment crackling in protest at her rough, urgent movements. Thump, drag, another sound from outside, closer this time, accompanied by the dislodging of loose stones. It was definitely footsteps, heavy and deliberate, not the skittish movements of an animal. Someone was methodically searching the courtyard, or perhaps knew exactly where they were going. Alara's heart hammered. There was no time to secure all the scrolls back in the chest and try to re-engage its complex lock. She had to act, now. Her eyes darted around the gloomy chamber, desperately seeking a hiding place for herself, more importantly, for the precious manuscript in her hand. The chest itself was too obvious, too exposed. With a surge of desperate strength, she pushed the heavy lid of the chest down as far as it would go. Though it didn't fully close without the lock re-engaging, it offered minimal protection, but it was better than leaving the entire contents exposed. The single scroll she held, De Motu Spherorum Coelestium, felt like a burning brand in her hands. She couldn't leave it, she wouldn't. Another sound, a low grunt, a man's voice, too indistinct to make out words but undeniably human, galvanized her. They were near the entrance of this very building. Her gaze fell upon a deep, shadowed alcove in the far wall, one that was partially obscured by a fallen roof timber and a thick curtain of ancient cobwebs. It was small, probably filthy, but it was the only immediate option. Clutching the precious scroll to her chest with one hand, she snatched up her still-burning candle stub with the other. To leave it lit would be to signpost her presence. With a puff of air, she extinguished the flame, plunging the chamber into near-total darkness, the only illumination now the faint, ghostly light filtering through the high, grimy windows. Moving as silently as a shadow, her bare feet making little sound on the dusty stone floor, she navigated through the debris towards the alcove. Each rustle of her robes, each dislodged pebble, sounded deafeningly loud to her own ears. She squeezed into the narrow space, pressing herself back against the cold, damp stone, the cobwebs clinging to her hair and face. The rough timber offered some cover. She held her breath, straining her ears. The heavy footsteps stopped just outside the doorway. A dark silhouette, then two, filled the entrance, blocking what little light came from the courtyard. They were large men, their forms indistinct in the gloom, but their presence radiated a palpable menace. "Anything?" a gruff voice rumbled, the sound echoing in the vast chamber. "Place is a ruin, smells like a tomb." Another voice, sharper and more impatient, replied, "You sure this is where the old man said she'd be sniffing around?" Alara's blood ran cold. She? They were looking for her. This wasn't a random encounter. They knew, or suspected, her purpose. How? Had her inquiries been less subtle than she'd believed? Had someone betrayed her? He said a foreign woman, asking too many questions about the old scriptorium. This is the only one left standing, with a roof, however rotten. The first voice spoke again. "Fan out. If she sits here, or if she found anything, the master wants it." Alara pressed herself further into the alcove, her body rigid, the scroll clutched so tightly against her chest that its edges dug into her skin. She could hear them entering the chamber, their footsteps heavy and careless, kicking aside debris. The faint, acrid smell of their unwashed bodies and stale sweat reached her, making her stomach churn. One of them carried a flickering torch, its smoky light beginning to penetrate the deeper shadows, casting monstrous, elongated figures on the crumbling walls. Her hiding place was deep, but would it be deep enough? Her hiding place was deep, but would it be deep enough? The torchlight, though still distant, began to creep insidiously along the floor, illuminating patches of debris, then a section of the wall perilously close to her alcove. Alara flattened herself further against the cold stone, her breath shallow, her ears straining to catch every sound over the frantic thumping of her own heart. The precious scroll was a hard, unyielding pressure against her ribs, a silent testament to the danger she was in. "Nothing but dust and rat droppings here," the sharper voice grumbled, punctuated by the sound of something being kicked aside, perhaps a loose stone or a piece of rotten wood. The old fool was probably senile, or she came, found nothing, and left. The master was clear. The first voice, deeper and more methodical, replied. "He said she's been asking about the Athelberg whispers, and he doesn't like scholars who poke their noses into things that don't concern them. Check that end." Alara heard their footsteps separate. One set moved further into the chamber, towards the area where she had first entered. The other was coming closer to her side of the room. The torchlight grew stronger, casting a more defined, though still flickering, orange glow that reached the edge of the fallen timber, partially concealing her. She could smell the acrid smoke of the torch now, and with it, the rank, unwashed scent of the man who carried it. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, then forced them open, compelling herself to watch, to be aware. The man was methodical, his torch held high, its light sweeping across the empty niches, the piles of rubble, the cobweb-draped walls. He was moving slowly, deliberately, his gaze scanning every shadow. He was now only a few paces from the fallen roof timber. Any moment now, his light would penetrate her alcove. Then his attention was caught by something else. "Ah, what's this then?" Alara's heart leaped into her throat. He had stopped. She risked the slightest movement, peering through a tiny gap in the timber. The torchlight was now focused on the large wooden chest. He had found it. "Looks like a chest, Harun," the man called out to his companion. "An old one, but sturdy." "A chest?" Harun Sip's voice came from across the room. "Well, don't just stare at it, you oaf. See if it opens." Could be what she was after. Or maybe just some old temple junk. The man with the torch grunted. He placed the torch into a fissure in a nearby pile of rocks, a reckless act that sent a shower of sparks into the air, freeing his hands. Alara watched, her body rigid with a mixture of fear and a desperate, fragile hope. The lock, she thought. The complex lock held. I couldn't close it properly, but perhaps it looked secured. He tugged at the lid. It didn't budge much, given its weight and the fact it wasn't fully latched, but also not freely open. Heavy and locked tight, it seems. He kicked it. Damn solid. "Locked?" Harun sounded annoyed. "Bring it. If it sits locked, it might be worth something. The master will have ways to open it, or we can just break it open later. No point wasting time here, if the woman sits flown." The man near the chest grumbled, but then seemed to assess its size and weight. "It'll take both of us to move this thing any distance. It's massive." He gave the lid another cursory, frustrated pull, because Alara hadn't fully re-engaged the internal mechanism. The lid lifted that same slight inch it had for her, before settling back down with a dull thud when he released it. "Did you see that?" he said, a new note of interest in his voice. "It moved, not locked as tight as I thought, or maybe just a tricky latch." He bent closer, peering at the edges. Alara's hope plummeted. He was going to find it. He was going to find the opening. She held the single scroll against her, its ancient wisdom, a fragile shield against the encroaching menace. If they found the scrolls in the chest, her own hidden presence, clutching this lone manuscript, would be her death warrant. The scriptorium, moments ago, a place of exhilarating discovery, had become a trap. Alara's hope plummeted. He was going to find it. He was going to find the opening. She held the single scroll against her, its ancient wisdom, a fragile shield against the encroaching menace. If they found the scrolls in the chest, her own hidden presence, clutching this lone manuscript, would be her death warrant. The scriptorium, moments ago a place of exhilarating discovery, had become a trap. The man grunted again, his silhouette large and ominous against the flickering light of the torch. He sipped, propped nearby. He ran thick, grimy fingers along the edge of the lid, feeling for purchase. "There's a give here, Harun. I think if we both pull, then get on with it." Harun's sips, impatient voice, echoed from across the chamber. "I don't it like this place. Feels like we set to stirring up more than just dust." The man positioned himself, bracing his feet. Alara could hear his heavy breathing. This was it. He was going to lift the lid enough for them to see inside. Her mind raced, a frantic, trapped animal seeking escape. Should she scream, try to create a diversion? But what? Any sound would pinpoint her location. Just as the man was about to heave, a different sound cut through the tense silence of the scriptorium. A sharp, piercing whistle from the courtyard outside, followed by an urgent shout, the words indistinct, but the tone clearly one of alarm or summons. Both men in the chamber froze. What in the blighted sands was that? Harun hissed, his voice suddenly losing its impatient edge and gaining a sharper note of caution. The man by the chest straightened up, his attention instantly diverted from the stubborn lid. "Sounds like Jafar's sip signal. Trouble. Trouble? What kind of trouble?" Harun was already moving towards the doorway, his earlier bravado gone. "Did you tie up those blasted camels properly?" "Of course I did," the first man snapped, though he too was now looking towards the entrance with unease, the chest momentarily forgotten. "Maybe it sips the city watch, or rivals. This part of town ain't exactly friendly after dark, even if it ain't fully dark yet." The urgent whistle sounded again, closer this time, more insistent. "We need to go," Harun decided, his voice low and urgent. "Now, if Jafar is signaling like that, it's Sirius, the master one, sick thank us. If we get ourselves caught or knifed over some dusty scrolls we haven't sipped even seen." The first man hesitated, casting a frustrated glance back at the chest. "But the master said this was important." "The master also said not to get caught," Harun retorted sharply. He was already at the doorway, peering out cautiously. "Forget the chest for now. If the woman was here, she sits likely long gone or hidden too deep to find quickly. We can come back if we need to, with more men. Let sits move." With a final, reluctant look at the chest, the first man grunted in agreement. He snatched his torch from the rock fissure, and together the two dark figures melted back through the doorway, their heavy footsteps receding quickly as they hurried out of the courtyard. Alara remained pressed into the alcove, her body trembling uncontrollably, not daring to breathe, let alone move. She listened until the last echoes of their departure faded, replaced once more by the profound, tomb-like silence of the scriptorium, broken only by the frantic hammering of her own heart and the distant, muted sounds of the city. Were they truly gone, or was it a trick, a way to lure her out? She waited, counting her heartbeats, each second stretching into an eternity. The silence held, slowly, agonizingly. The tension in her limbs began to ease, though the fear remained, a cold residue in her veins. The scroll, still clutched to her chest, felt like both a terrible burden and an incredible triumph. She had found the Athelberg treatises, or at least a significant part of them, but she was also discovered, hunted, and her enemies knew where to look. She waited, counting her heartbeats, each second stretching into an eternity. The silence held, slowly, agonizingly. The tension in her limbs began to ease, though the fear remained, a cold residue in her veins. The scroll, still clutched to her chest, felt like both a terrible burden and an incredible triumph. She had found the Athelberg treatises, or at least a significant part of them, but she was also discovered, hunted, and her enemies knew where to look. Cautiously, like a small animal emerging after a predator has passed, Alara peered out from her alcove. The chamber was empty, steeped in the same dusty gloom as before, but now tainted with the lingering scent of the intruder's sweat and the smoky residue of their torch. The chest sat where they had left it, its lid slightly ajar. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to get as far away from this accursed scriptorium as possible. But the scrolls, she couldn't abandon them. Not now, not after coming so far. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she forced herself out of the narrow hiding place. Her legs were stiff and trembling. She moved to the chest, her ears straining for any sound from the courtyard. Silence. She relit her own small candle stub, its tiny flame a pitiful defense against the encroaching darkness and her own fear. The lid of the chest lifted easily. Now that she knew its secret, her eyes fell upon the tightly packed rolls of parchment. There were dozens, far too many to carry easily or discreetly. A fresh wave of despair washed over her. How could she possibly transport them all to safety? Her modest satchel, designed for a few personal belongings and perhaps one or two small codices, was wholly inadequate. She quickly scanned the chamber again. There was nothing here that could serve as a sack or a larger bag. The tattered remnants of cloth she'd seen earlier were too fragile, too rotten. A desperate plan began to form. She couldn't take them all, not now, but she couldn't leave them for her pursuers either. She selected 3 more of the most promising-looking scrolls from the top layer, ones whose bindings or exposed edges hinted at significant diagrams or particularly dense script. Adding them to the one she already held, she now had 4. It was a pitiful fraction of the whole, but it was something. It was a start, and it was perhaps all she could manage to conceal and carry without drawing undue attention. What of the rest? Her heart ached at the thought of leaving them. But to stay longer, to try and move the entire chest, or find a way to transport its full contents, was to invite capture. She had to assume the men, or others sent by their master, would return perhaps sooner rather than later. With a heavy heart, she carefully rearranged the remaining scrolls in the chest, trying to make it seem as if it hadn't been significantly disturbed beyond the initial pried lid. She then pressed the hidden indentation, and with a soft click, the internal mechanism seemed to reseat, making the lid feel more secure, though not truly locked. It was a small deception, perhaps a futile one, but it was all she could do. Clutching her 4 precious scrolls tightly, wrapped now in a spare piece of cloth from her satchel, she took one last look around the ruined chamber. This place of discovery had become a place of immense peril. The shadows seemed deeper now, the silence more menacing. She crept to the doorway, listening intently. The courtyard outside appeared deserted, the fading light of dusk casting long, eerie shadows. The urgent whistle and shouts that had saved her had long since faded, leaving an unsettling quiet in their wake. Were those sounds related to her pursuers, or a fortunate, unrelated incident? She couldn't know. She could only assume the worst. Taking a deep breath, Elara slipped out into the courtyard, her body a coiled spring of tension, ready to flee at the slightest sound. The journey back through the winding alleyways of the old quarter, which had seemed merely ancient and mysterious on her arrival, now felt like a gauntlet. Every shadowed doorway a potential threat, every distant footstep a possible pursuer. Her only thought was to reach the relative anonymity of the more crowded streets, and then somehow to find a new, safer place to hide, a place where she could examine her treasures and plan her next move in this deadly game of discovery and pursuit. Her only thought was to reach the relative anonymity of the more crowded streets, and then, somehow, to find a new, safer place to hide, a place where she could examine her treasures and plan her next move in this deadly game of discovery and pursuit. Each shadow seemed to lengthen and twist into menacing shapes. Every distant shout or burst of laughter from unseen courtyards made her jump. The weight of the 4 scrolls, pressed tightly against her body beneath her robes, was both a comfort and a terrifying liability. They were her triumph, but they could also be her death sentence. She forced herself to walk, not run, mimicking the unhurried pace of the few other figures she encountered in the deepening twilight of the old quarters alleys. To run would be to draw attention, to signal herself as prey. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the symphony of her fear. She replayed the encounter in the scriptorium over and over in her mind. The men's voices, their certainty that she was the one they sought, the mention of a master. Who was this master, so interested in the Athelberg whispers, so keen to silence a lone scholar? The question sent a chill down her spine. Finally, she emerged from the suffocating maze of the old quarter into a wider, more populated thoroughfare, one that led towards the main bazaar and the district where many of the city's caravanserais were located. The air here was thicker with the smells of cooking food, incense, and the general hubbub of a city still awake, though winding down for the night. The increased noise and movement, which would normally have felt overwhelming, now offered a thin veil of anonymity. She pulled her headscarf lower, trying to blend into the river of people. Her rented room, she knew, was no longer safe. If her inquiries had led her pursuers to the scriptorium, they would surely have traced her lodgings as well. She needed somewhere new, somewhere anonymous, at least for a night or two. A caravanserai, with its constant flow of travellers, might offer the best chance of disappearing. She found one near the western gate of the city, a sprawling, noisy compound already crowded with merchants, pilgrims, and travellers of all descriptions. The air was thick with the smell of animals, wood smoke, and countless unfamiliar languages. After a brief, impersonal exchange with a harried-looking innkeeper, she secured a small windowless room in a secluded corner of the upper gallery, paying with a few of the carefully hoarded coins she kept for emergencies. Once inside, the door bolted. She leaned against it for a long moment, her body trembling with reaction. The room was tiny, bare save for a thin sleeping mat and a rough wooden stool, but for now it felt like a sanctuary. Only then did she allow herself to carefully unwrap the 4 scrolls. Laying them on the mat, her small candle stub, relit with shaking hands, cast a flickering, intimate glow over the ancient parchment. Her breath hitched. Even in her fear, the scholar in her thrilled at the sight. These were not mere objects. They were vessels of lost time, of forgotten genius. She chose one at random, its silk tie a deep, faded indigo. Gently she unrolled it. This scroll was different from the astronomical treatise. It was denser with text, fewer diagrams. As her eyes scanned the opening lines, a gasp escaped her. This was philosophy, but a philosophy unlike any she had ever encountered from that period. Arguments for a rational universe, for the power of human observation, challenging the dogmatic assertions that had dominated scholarly thought for centuries. It was breathtaking in its audacity, its clarity. She moved to another scroll. This one contained intricate drawings of what looked like lenses and optical devices, accompanied by notes on the properties of light and refraction, knowledge that, if authentic, and from the period she suspected, was centuries ahead of its time. All warred with a growing sense of dread. The Ethelberg treatises were not just lost knowledge, they were dangerous knowledge. Ideas like these could shatter established doctrines, threaten powerful institutions. No wonder someone wanted them suppressed, and anyone who sought them silenced. The master her pursuers had spoken of was likely someone who understood the power contained within these fragile rolls of parchment. The weight of her discovery settled upon her, heavier now than the physical scrolls themselves. She had unearthed a treasure, yes, but also a hornet's nest. Her initial plan had been to study the treatises, perhaps find a way to subtly reintroduce their wisdom to the world. Now, her primary concern was survival, and the protection of these few fragments she had managed to save. Khorzan, the city of 1,000 secrets, had yielded one to her, but in doing so, it had also made her a target. She was alone, in a foreign city, with enemies she did not know, clutching a truth that the world, or at least powerful elements within it, might not be ready to receive. She was alone, in a foreign city, with enemies she did not know, clutching a truth that the world, or at least powerful elements within it, might not be ready to receive. The small windowless room in the caravanserai, which had briefly felt like a sanctuary, now seemed to press in on her, its silence amplifying the frantic beating of her heart. Sleep was impossible. Her mind raced, sifting through possibilities, each one more perilous than the last. First the scrolls. She couldn't keep them simply wrapped in cloth in her satchel. It was too risky, too easily discovered, if her room was searched, or if she was accosted. Her gaze fell upon her own travel-worn robes. The thick, dark fabric, designed for the harsh desert climate, had many folds and an inner lining. With painstaking care, Using a small needle and thread she always carried for repairs, she began to sew the 4 precious scrolls into the lining of her innermost garment, distributing their bulk as evenly as possible. It made the robe slightly stiffer, a little more cumbersome, but it was the best she could do. Now they were a part of her, moving with her, as concealed as her own fear. But what next? To stay in Khorasan was to invite further pursuit. The master, who employed those men, would not give up easily, not if he suspected the nature of what she had found, or even what she was looking for. He would have eyes and ears throughout the city. Every shadow could conceal an enemy, every friendly face a potential informant. Leaving Khorasan presented its own formidable challenges. Traveling alone, she was already vulnerable. Traveling alone, with a secret that powerful men were hunting for, was courting disaster. She would need to find a caravan, one heading in a direction that offered some hope of safety, or at least a place where she could regroup and decide her ultimate destination. West, back towards the familiar, but potentially compromised, centers of learning in her own lands. Or east, further into the unknown, towards the fabled cities of Samarkand or Balkh, where perhaps different schools of thought might be more receptive, or where she might simply disappear more easily into the teeming masses. Exhaustion gnawed at her, blurring her thoughts. She knew she needed rest, but her mind refused to quiet. She doused her small candle, plunging the room into absolute darkness, and lay down on the thin mat, her hand instinctively going to the place where the scrolls were now sewn against her body. Their slight, unfamiliar pressure was a constant reminder of her precarious situation. Every sound from the bustling caravanserai outside her door, a shouted word, a burst of laughter, the braying of a donkey, made her start. She imagined footsteps pausing outside her door, the glint of an eye at a crack in the wood. She dozed fitfully, her sleep filled with fragmented nightmares, shadowy figures with grasping hands, crumbling scriptoriums, and ancient, indecipherable texts that whispered warnings she couldn't understand. Before the first true light of dawn, Ilara was awake. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but with it, a renewed sense of fragile determination. She had come too far, risked too much, to surrender now. The Athelberg treatises, even these few fragments, were a sacred trust. She had a duty, not just to her own scholarly passion, but to the forgotten minds who had penned these revolutionary ideas. She ate the last of the dried fruit, her mind already working. She needed to be an observer today, to move through the city with a different kind of awareness. She would visit the main bazaar, not as a scholar seeking information, but as a traveller looking to join a caravan. She would listen, watch, and try to discern any unusual interest in her, any sign that her pursuers were closing in. And she would try to learn more about the caravans departing in the coming days, their destinations, their reputations for safety, the character of their leaders. Her survival, and the survival of the knowledge she carried, depended on the choices she made now. The city of Khorasan, once a place of scholarly pilgrimage, had become a treacherous labyrinth she had to navigate with utmost care. Instead, she listened to the conversations of other travellers, to the boasts of camel drivers, to the negotiations between merchants seeking to transport their goods. It was a slow, painstaking process, requiring patience and a keen ear for nuance. The sun climbed higher, and the bazaar grew more crowded, the noise more intense. Ilara felt the oppressive weight of unseen eyes, the constant thrum of potential danger. Several times she thought she spotted a figure watching her too intently from across a crowded square, or a pair of men whose descriptions seemed chillingly familiar to those from the scriptorium, but they always melted into the throng before she could be certain. After hours that felt like days, her patience was rewarded. Huddled near a tea stall, pretending to examine a tray of cheap trinkets, she overheard 2 merchants discussing their arrangements. A large, well-guarded caravan, led by a reputable Khitan master named Bao, was due to depart for the oasis city of Dunhuang, eastward along the Silk Road, at dawn on the 3rd day hence. Dunhuang, with its famed cave libraries and diverse population of scholars and monks, felt like a beacon of possibility. More importantly, the caravan was large enough to offer a degree of anonymity and protection. Her heart quickened. This was her chance, but securing passage would not be easy. She needed to approach Baal, or one of his trusted men, without revealing her desperation or the true nature of her scholarly pursuits. That evening, after carefully scouting the area where Bao's caravan was assembling near the eastern gate, Alara made her move. She found Bao himself, a stern-faced man with eyes that seemed to miss nothing, overseeing the loading of goods. Taking a deep breath, she approached him, explaining, in carefully chosen, deferential words, that she was a humble student of history and languages, seeking safe passage east to further her studies in Dunhuang, and that she had heard of his reputation for running a secure and disciplined caravan. She offered a fair price, drawn from her dwindling funds. Bao scrutinized her for a long, uncomfortable moment. His gaze was piercing, and Alara felt a flush rise to her cheeks, fearing he saw more than she intended. She thought of the men in the scriptorium of the master. Was Bao connected? Could this be another trap? Finally, he gave a curt nod. We have room for one more, if you do not cause trouble, and keep to yourself. Be here before the first light. 2 days from now, we wait for no one. Relief, so potent it almost buckled her knees, washed through Alara, quickly followed by a renewed wave of anxiety. 2 more days in Khorzan, 2 more days to evade her pursuers. The next day and a half passed in a blur of heightened vigilance. Alara rarely left her small room, venturing out only for essential water and a little food, always feeling the prickle of unseen eyes. She spent the hours rereading the 4 precious scrolls, committing as much as she could to memory, her awe at their contents growing with each passing hour. The knowledge they contained was truly revolutionary, a testament to a forgotten era of intellectual brilliance. On the eve of her departure, as she made one last, cautious foray to ensure her meagre supplies were in order, disaster nearly struck. Turning a corner into a less crowded alley near her caravanserai, she came face to face with one of the men from the scriptorium, the one with the sharper voice. His eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed with predatory triumph. Well, well, look who we have here, he sneered, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the wicked-looking dagger at his belt. The little scholar didn't fly so far after all. Alara didn't hesitate. There was no time for words, no chance for negotiation. She spun on her heel and fled, her heart pounding in her ears. He shouted behind her, and she heard the thud of his footsteps giving chase. She ran as she had never run before, dodging through the throngs of evening shoppers, upsetting a fruit cart, her only thought to reach the crowded, chaotic sanctuary of the main bazaar. She could hear him gaining. Just as despair began to set in, she saw her chance. A procession, a local wedding perhaps, was moving slowly down a connecting street, complete with musicians, brightly clad dancers, and a cheering crowd. Without a second thought, Alara ducked into the midst of the celebrants, her plain robes and lowered head allowing her to merge, however awkwardly, with the periphery of the joyous throng. She pushed deeper, using the chaos and the moving wall of people as a shield. Looking back frantically, she saw her pursuer, momentarily blocked and disoriented by the unexpected river of humanity. She didn't stop. Weaving her way through the procession, she emerged on another street and continued her flight, taking a circuitous route back towards the eastern gate. Not daring to return to her compromised room, she would spend the night hidden amongst the bales and animals of Bao's assembling caravan, trusting to the darkness and the general commotion. Before the first hint of grey light touched the sky, Alara was awake, her body aching, her nerves raw, but her resolve hardened. She found Bao, who merely grunted at her early appearance. As the massive caravan slowly began to move, creaking and groaning its way out of the eastern gate of Khorzan, Alara was nestled anonymously amongst a group of pilgrims. She looked back one last time at the city's receding walls, a place of both wondrous discovery and terrifying peril. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with its own dangers. The master and his agents were still a threat, and the knowledge she carried felt like a heavy, precious weight sewn into the fabric of her being. But as the sun rose, casting its golden light over the vast open road leading east, Alara felt a fragile sliver of hope. She had the scrolls, she had her life, and the Athelberg treatises, silenced for centuries, now had a voice, however faint, however hunted, on its journey back into the world. Her own quest, she knew, was far from over. In many ways, it had just begun. The saga of Rome's legions is etched in the very foundations of Western history, a narrative of conquest, engineering, brutal warfare, and the imposition of an empire that stretched from the misty highlands of Caledonia to the sun-scorched sands of Egypt. Among these formidable military machines, Legio IX Hispana, the 9th Hispanic Legion, holds a particularly enigmatic place. Forged in the crucible of the late Republic and tempered through centuries of service, its story is one of dedication and hardship, culminating not in a clearly recorded demise or dignified disbandment, but in a mysterious silence that has fueled speculation and debate for nearly 2 millennia. To understand the mystery of its disappearance, one must first appreciate the Legion's long and often arduous journey through Roman history. The precise origins of Legio IX are like those of many legions formed during the tumultuous final decades of the Roman Republic, somewhat veiled. While traditionally associated with Julius Caesar, who listed a 9th Legion among the veteran units that served him with distinction throughout his Gallic Wars, 58-50 BC, and the subsequent civil war against Pompey, there is evidence to suggest its lineage might stretch back even further. Some scholars propose an earlier formation in Hispania, modern-day Spain and Portugal, under Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, during his campaigns there in the 70s BC. Regardless of its exact nativity, by the time Caesar consolidated his power, the 9th was undeniably one of his most loyal and battle-hardened formations. Its legionaries participated in pivotal engagements, from the grueling sieges in Gaul to the decisive Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, where Caesar shattered Pompey's forces. The cognomen Hispana was likely earned, or formally recognized, during the reign of Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Following Caesar's assassination and another round of bloody civil wars, Octavian, later Augustus, deployed the 9th extensively in his campaigns to finally subdue the fiercely resistant Cantabrian and Asturian tribes of northern Hispania, 29-19 BC. This was a brutal, protracted conflict, fought in mountainous terrain against an elusive enemy. The legion's exemplary service in these wars, which cemented Roman control over the Iberian Peninsula, probably led to the award of its honorific title, forever linking it to the land where its valor was so starkly proven. The eagle of the 9th, its Aquila, would henceforth be a symbol not just of Roman authority, but of the specific tenacity forged in the Spanish mountains. Following its service in Hispania, Legio IX Hispana was stationed in various parts of the rapidly expanding empire. For a significant period, it was part of the formidable Roman army garrisoning the Balkans, likely based in Pannonia, guarding the crucial Danubian frontier against incursions from Sarmatian and Germanic tribes. Life on such frontiers was a relentless cycle of patrol, fortification construction, and occasional sharp, brutal conflicts. It was here that the legionaries honed their skills, their discipline maintained through rigorous training and the ever-present threat of barbarian raids. The next major chapter in the 9th's history began in 43 AD, when Emperor Claudius, seeking military glory and the strategic resources of Britain, launched the Roman invasion of the island. Legio IX Hispana was one of the 4 legions selected for this ambitious undertaking, a testament to its reputation and combat readiness. Commanded by Aulus Plautius, the invasion force landed in Kent, and after overcoming initial resistance, began the systematic conquest of southeastern Britain. The 9th played a crucial role in these early campaigns, pushing northwards and westwards, subjugating Celtic tribes like the Cativelluni and the Trinovantes. By the early 50s AD, the Legion had established a permanent fortress at Lindum, modern-day Lincoln, strategically positioned to control the tribes of the Midlands and to project Roman power further north into the territory of the powerful Brigantes. From Lindum, the 9th operated as a frontier legion, constantly engaged in pacification efforts, road building, and the establishment of Roman administration. The challenges were immense, the terrain was often difficult, the climate harsh and unfamiliar, and the native Britons, though fragmented, were frequently hostile, resentful of Roman rule and the imposition of taxes and Roman law. The legion's mettle was severely tested during the cataclysmic Boudiccan revolt of 16 AD, Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe, enraged by Roman brutality and expropriation of lands, led a massive rebellion that engulfed southern Britain. The Iceni and their allies, including the Trinovantes, destroyed Camulodunum, Colchester, the Roman provincial capital, and then marched on Londinium, London and Verulamium, St. Albans, massacring their inhabitants and razing the cities. At the time, the bulk of the Roman army in Britain, under Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was campaigning far away in North Wales against the Druidic stronghold of Mona Anglesey. Quintus Petilius Cerealis, the legate commanding Legio IX Hispana, found himself as the closest available Roman force to the rapidly advancing rebel tide. With a force comprising primarily the 9th, likely numbering around 5,000 men, but possibly with only a portion of its full infantry strength immediately available, Cerealis made the courageous but ill-fated decision to intercept Boudica's massive army, estimated to be tens of thousands strong. The ensuing battle, fought somewhere in the Midlands, was a disaster for the Romans. The 9th was overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Its infantry, fighting with desperate courage, was cut to pieces. Cerealis himself, along with his cavalry, managed to escape and take refuge in a temporary fort. Roman historians like Tacitus record that all the foot soldiers were slaughtered. While this was likely an exaggeration typical of ancient historical rhetoric, the losses were undoubtedly catastrophic, perhaps as high as 2,000 legionaries, a significant portion of its fighting strength. The defeat of the 9th's infantry contingent sent shockwaves through the Roman province. It seemed as if Roman rule in Britain might collapse. However, Suetonius Paulinus, force-marching his legions, 14 Gemina, and parts of the Tix Valeria Victrix south, eventually confronted Boudica's army at a location still debated by historians, often referred to as the Battle of Watling Street, and despite being outnumbered, achieved a decisive Roman victory, crushing the rebellion. For Legio IX Hispana, the Boudican revolt was a brutal lesson in the perils of underestimating the barbarian foe and the dangers of operating with insufficient numbers in hostile territory. The legion, though mauled, was not erased. It was subsequently reinforced with legionaries drawn from legions in Germania and slowly rebuilt. Quintus Petilius Cerealis, despite the defeat, would later return to Britain as governor and would again command elements of the 9th in further campaigns, particularly against the Brigantes in northern England. In the aftermath of the Boudican revolt, the process of Roman consolidation in Britain continued. Around 71 AD, during Cerealis' governorship, Legio IX Hispana was moved further north from Lincoln to a new, strategically vital legionary fortress constructed at Eboracum, modern-day York. Eboracum was situated at the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss, providing excellent communication routes and a commanding position to control the Vale of York and to launch campaigns against the still restive Brigantes and other northern tribes. For nearly 4 decades, Eboracum would serve as the 9th's primary base. From here, its cohorts marched on numerous campaigns, including those under the famed governor Gnaeus Julius Agricola, 77–84 AD, who pushed Roman arms deep into Caledonia, Scotland, culminating in the victory at Mons Gropius. The 9th undoubtedly played its part in these arduous northern wars, enduring long marches, harsh weather, and fierce resistance, extending the boundaries of the Roman Empire to their northernmost extent in Britain. Life in Eboracum involved not only military duties, but also extensive construction work, with the legionaries responsible for building and maintaining their fortress, roads, bridges, and other infrastructure, stamping Roman authority onto the landscape. It is from Eboracum, in the early years of the 2nd century AD, during the reign of Emperor Trajan, that the last undisputed evidence of Legio IX Hispana in Britain emerges. An inscription on a monumental stone tablet, part of a gateway of the legionary fortress at York, records that it was rebuilt by the 9th Legion in 108 AD. This inscription, a proud testament to the legion's enduring presence and engineering prowess, ironically also marks the point where its trail in Britain begins to grow cold. heralding one of Roman history's most enduring mysteries. What happened to the legionaries who carved those letters, and the thousands of their comrades who served under the eagle of the 9th Hispana in the misty, challenging lands of northern Britain? The stone proclaims their work. History thereafter largely observes their silence. The stone proclaims their work. History thereafter largely observes their silence. The period following 108 AD in Roman Britain was one of continued tension and flux, particularly in the north. While Emperor Trajan, 98-117 AD, was largely preoccupied with wars on the Danubian frontier against Dacia and in the east against Parthia, Britain remained a province that demanded constant vigilance and a significant military presence. The northern tribes of Caledonia, a loose confederation of peoples, including those later known as the Picts, were never fully subdued. They remained a persistent threat, launching raids across the ill-defined frontier, testing Roman resolve, and necessitating periodic punitive expeditions by Roman forces. Archaeological evidence from this period, roughly between 105 AD and the arrival of Emperor Hadrian in 122 AD, points to unrest and warfare in northern Britain. Several Roman forts along the Staingate Road, a line of fortifications that predated Hadrian's Wall, show signs of destruction or abandonment, suggesting coordinated attacks or a strategic Roman withdrawal from certain advanced positions. It's a murky period, with literary sources like the Augustan history, and much later, an often unreliable collection of imperial biographies, hinting at a serious crisis. At the beginning of his Hadrian's reign, the Britons could not be kept under Roman control. This implies significant trouble, possibly a major uprising, or a series of damaging defeats for Roman arms in the years immediately preceding Hadrian's accession. It is into this volatile environment that the traditional narrative of the 9th Legion's demise fits. If Legio IX Hispana was still stationed at Eboracum, or operating in the north, after 108 AD, it would undoubtedly have been involved in suppressing any such unrest. The theory that it marched north to confront a major tribal confederacy and was overwhelmed and destroyed in a cataclysmic battle, perhaps around 117-119 AD, gained currency because it seemed to offer a dramatic explanation for both the legion's disappearance from British records and the subsequent major strategic shift embodied by the construction of Hadrian's Wall. Hadrian, who became emperor in 117 AD, was a pragmatic ruler, known for his focus on consolidating and fortifying the empire's frontiers, rather than pursuing aggressive expansion. He visited Britain in 122 AD, and it was during this visit that the decision was made to construct the monumental barrier that would bear his name. Hadrian's Wall, stretching 73 Roman miles, about 117 kilometers from the Tyne to the Solway Firth, was a formidable statement of Roman intent to define and defend a permanent frontier. Such a massive undertaking, involving tens of thousands of troops in its construction and garrisoning, could indeed be interpreted as a response to a perceived vulnerability or a recent military disaster in the north. If the 9th had been lost, the remaining legions in Britain, Legio Sic and Augusta, Legoso Six Victrix, which Hadrian brought with him to replace the 9th or another departed unit, and Legio Six Valeria Victrix, would have been severely stretched, making a more defensible static frontier essential. For many years the narrative seemed relatively straightforward. The 9th marched north from York after 108 AD, vanished in battle, and Hadrian's Wall was built as a consequence. The silence of the legion in British records after this date was taken as primary evidence. No further inscriptions unequivocally placing the entirety of Legio IX Hispana in Britain after 108 AD have been found. Moreover, when a list of Roman legions was compiled by Cassius Dio in the early 3rd century AD, the 9th was notably absent, implying it had ceased to exist by then. However, the neatness of this lost in Caledonia theory began to unravel with discoveries made, not in Britain, but on the European continent. In the city of Nijmegen, Noviomagus Batavarum, in the Roman province of Germania, Inferior, modern-day Netherlands, archaeological excavations in the 20th century unearthed crucial evidence. This included tile stamps, clearly bearing the insignia of Legio IX Hispana, Dio Legmegem Hispan, on fragments of an altar or monumental inscription dedicated by the Legion or its vexellations detachments. Crucially, the context of these finds dated them to a period after 108 AD, likely around 120 AD, or even slightly later. Some bronze pendants, possibly part of military decorations, inscribed with the Legion's name and dating to the Trajanic-Hadrianic period, were also found there. This evidence from Nijmegen presented a fundamental challenge to the traditional narrative. If elements of the 9th Legion, and quite possibly its main body, were stationed on the Rhine frontier around 121 AD, it could not have been annihilated in Britain in the years immediately prior. Legions were indeed transferred across the empire based on strategic needs, moving a legion from the relative quiet of a pacified area of Britain, if the south was considered so to the perennially sensitive Rhine frontier, was entirely plausible. The Rhine was a critical boundary, always demanding a strong military presence against Germanic tribes. The Nijmegen findings forced a re-evaluation. Perhaps the 9th Legion was not destroyed in Britain at all. Perhaps it was withdrawn, either in whole or in part, and redeployed. This opened up several new lines of inquiry. Was the entire Legion transferred to Nijmegen, or only a substantial vexillation? If the whole Legion left Britain, when exactly did this occur, and why? And if it survived its British posting and service on the Rhine, what then became of it? The emergence of the mystery of the Lost Legion is thus a product of these conflicting pieces of evidence, and the subsequent silences. As the last firm record in Britain, York, 108 AD, then strong evidence of its presence in Nijmegen, c. 120 AD, and then the trail goes cold again. No further definitive records of Legio IX Hispana as an active full-strength legion appear in the historical or archaeological record from the mid-Hadrianic period onwards. It is this second disappearance, after its apparent service on the Rhine, that constitutes the core of the modern enigma. The romantic notion of the legion vanishing in the mists of Scotland, while captivating, now seemed less likely to represent the whole truth. Instead, a more complex story began to emerge, one involving troop movements across provinces and an eventual fate that was still unclear, but probably not a single heroic last stand in Caledonia. The question shifted: if not lost in Britain, then where, when and how did Legio IX Hispana meet its end, or fade from the Roman order of battle? The stage was set for the development of new theories, each attempting to reconcile the disparate clues and explain the ultimate fate of this once proud legion. The silence from Britain was significant, but the brief reappearance on the Rhine suggested that the first chapter of its mysterious disappearance was perhaps not its last. Tentu saya akan mengubah bagian tersebut menjadi format narasi yang mengalir tanpa menggunakan judul atau poin-poin eksplisit sehingga membacanya lebih seperti cerita sejarah. The stage was thus set for the development of new theories, each attempting to reconcile the disparate clues and explain the ultimate fate of this once proud legion. While the silence from Britain was significant, the brief reappearance on the Rhine suggested that the first chapter of its mysterious disappearance was perhaps not its last. The core question remained: if Legio IX Hispana survived its British posting and saw service in Germania Inferior, what series of events led to its ultimate vanishing from the Roman military roster by the mid-century AD? One path the Legion's destiny might have taken after its presence in Nijmegen was annihilation on the volatile Rhine frontier itself, or deeper within Germania. Conflicts with Germanic tribes were frequent and could be devastating, raising the possibility that the Legion, after its transfer from Britain, became embroiled in a major unrecorded or poorly documented conflict. In such a scenario, it might have suffered catastrophic losses, effectively being destroyed or rendered combat ineffective. Arguments supporting this often point to the inherent dangers of this frontier. Although no single large-scale battle directly linked to the Ninth's destruction in this theatre has been identified, Roman history is not without examples of legions suffering heavy defeats that were sometimes downplayed or obscured in official accounts, especially if they occurred during punitive expeditions or reconnaissance missions deep into hostile territory. If the Ninth were lost in such a fashion, its remnants could have been absorbed into other Rhine legions, or the unit simply disbanded. However, a counter-argument lies in the relative stability of the Rhine frontier during the early reign of Hadrian compared to other flashpoints in the empire. Hadrian's policy was generally one of consolidation, not aggressive expansion into Germania. While skirmishes and localized conflicts undoubtedly occurred, a disaster on the scale of wiping out an entire legion might be expected to leave more distinct traces in the historical or archaeological record, perhaps through emergency reinforcements being sent to the region or significant changes in frontier policy. Thus, the evidence for the Ninth's end here remains largely circumstantial, based on the general perils of the region rather than specific data points directly implicating the legion. Another widely considered possibility, indeed one of the more plausible theories among modern historians, suggests that after a potential period of service on the Rhine, strategic imperatives dictated the Ninth's transfer to the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. The East was a constant source of concern for Rome throughout the 2nd century AD, with two major areas of conflict standing out. Firstly, the Parthian frontier remained a perennial hotspot. Rome and Parthia were long-standing rivals, and the border regions, particularly around Armenia, Syria, and Cappadocia, were frequently contested. Emperor Trajan had conducted extensive campaigns against Parthia shortly before Hadrian's reign, and though Hadrian initially adopted a more defensive posture, tensions remained high. It is conceivable that Legio IX Hispana was moved to Cappadocia, or Syria, as part of a strategic reinforcement, and subsequently suffered heavy losses in renewed hostilities or unrecorded border wars against the Parthians, leading to its effective destruction or disbandment. The rugged terrain and the formidable Parthian cataphracts, heavy cavalry and horse archers made warfare in this region particularly challenging for Roman heavy infantry. Secondly, the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea from 132 to 136 AD presented an exceptionally brutal and bloody conflict. This widespread Jewish rebellion against Roman rule, led by Simon Bar Kokhba, was fiercely fought. Roman historian Cassius Dio records that the Romans suffered very heavy casualties, so severe that Hadrian, in his report to the Senate, omitted the customary opening phrase, "If you and your children are well, it is well. I and the legions are well." Several legions were involved in suppressing the revolt, and some are known to have been mauled. Legio Tigatoidum Deo Tariana, for instance, seems to have disappeared from the records around this time, possibly annihilated or disbanded, due to losses in this war. Could Legio IX Hispana have been one of the legions sent to Judea, perhaps after its stint on the Rhine, and met a similar fate? The intense fighting and the desperate nature of the rebellion could certainly account for the destruction of a legion. Evidence supporting an eastern transfer, while not definitive for the entire legion's ultimate fate, does come from the careers of some of its known officers. Lucius Aemilius Carus, for example, known to have been a legate commander of the Ninth, later had a distinguished career becoming governor of Arabia around 142–143 AD. For him to have continued to such high office, it is usually inferred that his legion was not disgraced, though it could have been honorably disbanded after suffering severe losses, or he himself might have been transferred prior to a final disaster. While inscriptions found in the East referring to individuals who had served in the Ninth, or dedications by its veterans, are scarce and often debated regarding their dating and context, they keep the possibility of an Eastern deployment alive. For instance, a building inscription from Serene, Libya, by a vexillation of the Ninth Legion is sometimes cited, but its dating and relevance to the Legion's final years remain unclear. The primary challenge for any theory involving an Eastern demise is the persistent lack of a definitive record, a specific inscription or a clear historical account, placing the full Legion in a particular Eastern battle or campaign, where it was definitively lost or disbanded during the critical period of the 120s to 140s AD. The silence is undeniably frustrating. Beyond dramatic annihilations, there exists a category of less sensational but equally plausible scenarios involving administrative disbandment, renaming, or gradual attrition. For instance, While no record of a specific disgrace exists, legions could be disbanded if they performed poorly in battle, mutinied, or otherwise shamed themselves. In such cases, their name might be deliberately erased from official records, a form of damnatio memoriae for a military unit. However, the continued successful careers of some of its officers, like Aemilius Carus, might argue against a deep, irredeemable disgrace. Another possibility is that the legion was renamed or reconstituted. Sometimes legions that suffered heavy losses were reformed under a new number or name, or their surviving cohorts were merged into other units. If the Ninth suffered significantly in Britain, on the Rhine, or in an unrecorded eastern conflict, its remnants could have been absorbed, and Legio IX Hispana would have effectively ceased to exist as an independent entity. Furthermore, operating on dangerous frontiers for decades inevitably meant constant low-level casualties from skirmishes, disease, and accidents, alongside regular retirements. If for a prolonged period, recruitment and reinforcement failed to keep pace with these attritional losses, the legion's combat strength could have dwindled to the point where it was no longer viable as a full legion and was quietly disbanded or merged. This fading away scenario lacks the drama of a single decisive battle, but is a realistic possibility within the context of Roman military logistics and frontier warfare. Even the lost in Britain theory sometimes resurfaces in modified forms, while the Nijmegen evidence makes a complete annihilation around 117 AD in Caledonia, unlikely for the entire legion. Some still argue that a substantial vexillation of the Ninth might have remained in Britain, or perhaps returned there after its Rhine service. This detachment, the theory suggests, could subsequently have been lost in later northern conflicts. Such a scenario might account for the enduring local traditions and the perceived need for Hadrian's Wall, while also accommodating the continental evidence. However, there is no strong evidence to support the return of a major part of the Ninth to Britain after its likely transfer to Nijmegen. Ultimately, the enduring appeal of the mystery is that none of these theories can be proven with absolute certainty. Each has points in its favour and equally compelling arguments against it. The historical record is fragmented, and archaeological evidence, while sometimes illuminating, is often open to interpretation. The Ninth Legion seems to have slipped through the cracks of recorded history, its precise fate eluding definitive capture. The enduring appeal of the mystery is that none of these theories can be proven with absolute certainty. Each has points in its favour and points against it. The historical record is fragmented, and archaeological evidence, while sometimes illuminating, is often open to interpretation. The Ninth Legion seems to have slipped through the cracks of recorded history, its precise fate obscured by the passage of time and the fog of war. Modern historical scholarship, benefiting from a more comprehensive analysis of archaeological finds, epigraphic evidence, inscriptions, and a critical re-evaluation of literary sources, tends to move away from the simplistic narrative of a single, catastrophic annihilation in Caledonia around 117 AD. The evidence for the legion's presence, or at least that of significant detachments, in Nijmegen on the Rhine frontier around 120 AD, is now widely accepted as compelling. This firmly indicates that the legion, as a whole, was not wiped out in Britain before that date. The consensus, if one can be said to exist for such an enduring puzzle, leans towards a more complex scenario. Most historians now believe that Legio IX Hispana was indeed transferred from Britain, likely in its entirety, or as a very substantial core, to Germania Inferior, Nibelunge, in the early years of Hadrian's reign, possibly around 119–121 AD. This move might have been part of a broader strategic redeployment of forces by Hadrian, who was keen to stabilize frontiers across the empire. The legion that Hadrian brought with him to Britain in 122 AD, Legio VI Victrix, may have been intended as a direct replacement for the departed Ninth, tasked with garrisoning Iberacum York and contributing to the construction and manning of the new wall. What happened after Nijmegen remains the heart of the debate. The theory of a subsequent transfer to the Eastern Roman Empire holds considerable sway. The intense fighting during the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea, 132, 136 AD, is a strong candidate for a conflict where a legion could suffer such heavy losses as to be effectively destroyed or subsequently disbanded. As noted, Legio Tilintuental Deotariana likely met its end in this war. If the 9th was also deployed there, it might have shared a similar fate, its remnants perhaps too few to reconstitute the legion, or absorbed into other heavily depleted units. Alternatively, involvement in conflicts against Parthia in Cappadocia or Armenia, either during Hadrian's reign or that of his successor Antoninus Pius, 138-161 AD, also presents a plausible scenario for its demise. The eastern frontier was a notorious graveyard for Roman soldiers. The lack of a definitive death certificate for the legion, a clear historical account of its final battle, or an imperial decree of disbandment, is what keeps the mystery alive. It is possible that records were lost, or that the end was not a single dramatic event, but a more gradual process of attrition and eventual absorption into other units, which might not have warranted a specific, detailed historical mention beyond internal military administrative records that have not survived. The romantic image of the 9th Legion perishing heroically in the mists of northern Britain remains a powerful one, deeply embedded in popular culture. It speaks to a narrative of imperial overreach, barbarian resistance, and the haunting allure of a lost military unit. While this specific scenario is now largely discounted by scholarly consensus as the final fate of the entire legion, the very real dangers and attested conflicts in northern Britain during the early 2nd century AD cannot be ignored. It is still conceivable that vexations of the 9th suffered heavily in Britain before a main body transfer, or that the initial disappearance from British records was linked to a period of intense unrecorded warfare that contributed to the decision to redeploy the weakened unit. Ultimately, the story of Legio 9 Hispana is a compelling lesson in the complexities of historical investigation and the limits of our knowledge. We are left to piece together a narrative from fragments, a carved stone here, a stamped tile there, the career path of an officer, the deafening silence in later lists of legions. Each piece of evidence adds a layer to the puzzle, but the complete picture remains tantalizingly out of reach. The enduring fascination with the lost 9th Legion lies not just in the military aspect, but in what it represents: the vastness of the Roman Empire, the sacrifices of its anonymous soldiers, the often brutal and unforgiving nature of frontier life, and the poignant reality that even a celebrated unit with centuries of history could ultimately vanish, leaving behind more questions than answers. The legionaries of the 9th Hispana, who marched under its eagle from the fields of Gaul to the mountains of Hispania, the forests of Germania, and the rugged landscapes of Britannia, ultimately marched into a mystery that continues to captivate the historical imagination. Their final chapter may never be fully written, but their legacy and the enigma of their disappearance endures. Tonight, the year 1518. Imagine the city of Strasbourg, a bustling free imperial city within the Holy Roman Empire, nestled strategically along the River Ill in the fertile lands of Alsace. Its magnificent Gothic cathedral, with a spire that pierced the heavens, dominated a skyline of tightly packed, timber-framed houses, their upper stories leaning precariously over narrow, winding cobblestone streets. Strasbourg was a hub of commerce, a vital node on the trade routes connecting France, the German lands, Switzerland and Italy. Its markets teemed with goods, wine from the Alsatian slopes, grain from the surrounding plains, textiles and wares brought by merchants from afar. Yet, beneath this veneer of civic pride and mercantile activity, the early 16th century was a period of profound anxiety and hardship for its roughly 20,000 inhabitants. The preceding years had been cruel. The winter of 1517 had been unusually harsh, followed by a late frost that crippled vineyards and orchards. Yield, harvests led to scarcity, and the price of bread, the staple for the vast majority, had soared, pushing many into dire poverty and starvation. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making the populace vulnerable to the myriad diseases that stalked medieval and early Renaissance cities. The dreaded pest, bubonic plague, was an ever-present terror, capable of wiping out vast swathes of the population in a single season. Leprosy, though perhaps declining, still led to social ostracization, with lepers confined to lazar houses outside the city walls. And a new terrifying malady, known as the English sweat Suda Anglicus, had recently swept across parts of Europe, causing rapid death. Syphilis, believed by many to be a divine punishment for sin, added another layer of fear and suffering. The air itself often felt thick with the miasma of disease, the stench of uncollected waste, and the smoke from countless hearths burning whatever fuel could be found. In this world, life was short, often brutal, and perceived to be at the mercy of forces far beyond human control. Divine providence, demonic interference, astrological alignments, and the humours of the body were the accepted explanations for fortune and misfortune alike. The Church offered solace and a framework for understanding, but its authority was also beginning to be questioned, with figures like Martin Luther challenging established doctrines just the year before. Processions, veneration of saints' relics, and pilgrimages were common expressions of piety and desperate appeals for divine intervention against famine, plague, and other calamities. The fear of God's wrath was palpable, and the belief in curses, witchcraft, and the intercessory power of saints, particularly saints like Vitus, who could both inflict and cure afflictions, was deeply ingrained in the collective psyche. This was a society living on the edge, a tinderbox of stress, fear, and fervent, often desperate, religiosity. It was into this pressure cooker of a city, in the oppressive heat of a July day in 1518, that an ordinary woman known only as Fro Trophaea or Fro Trophaea, the spelling varies in chronicles, unknowingly lit a spark that would ignite one of history's most bizarre episodes. She lived on a modest street, likely one of the many narrow arteries snaking through Strasbourg's artisan quarters. We know little about her, her age, her social standing, her personal circumstances leading up to that fateful day. Was she a wife, a mother, a widow? Was she suffering from some private grief, a hidden illness, or simply the crushing weight of the era's pervasive hardships? The records are silent on these personal details, focusing only on the shocking public display that followed. One morning, Fro Trophaea stepped out of her house and began to dance. There was no accompanying music, no festive occasion, no apparent joy in her movements. Contemporary accounts, penned by civic chroniclers like Irenaeus Kohler and Sebastian Brandt, author of Ship of Fools, and later compiled by figures like Paracelsus and Johann Weyer, describe a scene of almost compulsive, agonizing exertion. Her body twisted and jerked, her arms flailed, her feet stamped rhythmically, but relentlessly, on the cobblestones. Her face, it was said, was contorted, perhaps in pain, perhaps in a trance-like state, her eyes unfocused. She danced for hours, under the scorching summer sun, oblivious to onlookers, driven by an unseen force. Passers-by would have stopped, stared, their initial curiosity perhaps tinged with amusement or mockery. A woman dancing alone in the street, with such strange intensity, was certainly an oddity. She continued for what seemed like an eternity, her clothes soaked with sweat, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Eventually, she would collapse from sheer exhaustion, only to rise again after a brief, insufficient rest and resume her frantic, silent ballet. This solitary, disturbing performance went on for several days, anywhere from 4 to 6, according to varying accounts. The initial small circles of curious or bewildered neighbours grew. What was a private, inexplicable torment was fast becoming a public spectacle. Whispers would have spread through the surrounding streets. Have you seen the dancing woman on Rue de la Messange? Is she possessed, mad, cursed? Then, the truly terrifying aspect of the phenomenon began. Within a week of Fro Trophaea's first public contortions, she was no longer alone. One by one, then in small groups, other individuals, mostly women at first, but soon men and even some children, began to join her. They didn't seem to be consciously imitating her. Rather, they appeared to be seized by the same irresistible compulsion. Their bodies, too, began to jerk and twirl. Some clutched their sides in pain, Others cried out or babbled incoherently. The silent solo dance had transformed into a growing, writhing chorus line of inexplicable, anguished movement. The dancing plague of 1518 had truly begun, and the city of Strasbourg was about to be plunged into a month of terrifying, bewildering chaos. The silent solo dance had transformed into a growing, writhing chorus line of inexplicable, anguished movement. The dancing plague of 1518 had truly begun, and the city of Strasbourg was about to be plunged into a month of terrifying, bewildering chaos. The contagion, if such a word can be applied to a phenomenon with no discernible pathogen, spread with alarming rapidity. What started with Frotrophere and a handful of others soon swelled into dozens, then scores, and according to some contemporary chroniclers, eventually numbered around 400 individuals at its peak. The narrow streets and small squares of Strasbourg became an impromptu, nightmarish ballroom. The dancers were a cross-section of society, though many accounts suggest the majority were women, and those from the poorer, more stressed segments of the population. They were not performing recognizable dance steps or joyful expressions of revelry. This was something raw, primal, and deeply unsettling. Their movements were often violent and uncoordinated, a desperate flailing of limbs, a constant stamping and shuffling of feet that wore through shoes and then skin. They would leap, twirl, and gyrate for hours, sometimes days on end, seemingly oblivious to their surroundings, their families' pleas, or their own mounting exhaustion and injuries. Witnesses described faces flushed or deathly pale, eyes wide and staring or rolled back in their heads, bodies drenched in sweat that soaked their simple peasant garments or the more substantial clothing of the better off. Some screamed, cried out, or babbled nonsensically. Others moved in a grim, determined silence, their features locked in an expression of intense concentration or vacant detachment. The lack of any apparent reason or common cause among the dancers only amplified the terror and confusion of those who watched. Was it a divine judgment, a demonic infestation, or some unknown physical malady sweeping through the terrified city? As the numbers grew, the normal life of Strasbourg began to break down. Markets were disrupted. Workshops fell silent as artisans either joined the dancers or stayed home in fear. The city's atmosphere, already thick with the anxieties of the era, became charged with a potent mixture of morbid fascination, fear, and a dawning sense of civic crisis. Families watched in horror as their loved ones were seized by the inexplicable urge, their pleas and attempts to restrain them often proving futile. The dancers, in their seemingly trance-like state, would often break free and rejoin the frenetic, ever-moving throngs. The physical toll on the afflicted was brutal. Sustained, intense physical exertion without adequate rest, food, or water quickly led to severe dehydration and exhaustion. Feet were bloodied, bruised, and swollen from constant impact on the hard cobblestones. Chroniclers record instances of broken bones, ribs, legs, arms, as dancers collapsed or collided with each other in their frenzied movements. There were reports of heart attacks and strokes. While precise numbers are impossible to verify, contemporary sources claim that as many as 15 people a day were dying at the height of the epidemic. Their bodies literally danced to death. The image of men and women collapsing and dying in the midst of a writhing, oblivious crowd must have been a scene of almost Boschen horror. Faced with this escalating and unprecedented crisis, the Strasbourg City Council, the Magistrat, was initially bewildered and then increasingly desperate. Their first recourse was to consult the city's physicians and the learned men of the local guilds. The prevailing medical theory of the time, rooted in the ancient Greek humoral system, attributed many ailments to an imbalance of the body's four humors. In this instance, the physicians diagnosed the dancing mania as a natural disease caused by an excess of hot blood in the brain. Their prescribed remedy, tragically, was based on the principle of contraries, or rather of expelling the excess through exertion. The afflicted must continue to dance, day and night, until the feverish humour was purged from their systems. Following this medical advice, the Magistrat took measures that in retrospect seem almost surreal. They ordered the clearing of public spaces to provide dedicated areas for the dancers, The horse market and the grain market were repurposed as open-air dance floors. Perhaps most astonishingly, they hired professional musicians, drummers, pipers, fiddlers, to play lively tunes, believing that music would encourage the continuous movement deemed necessary for a cure. They even went so far as to order the construction of a large wooden stage in one of the markets, effectively creating a public theatre for this bizarre and deadly performance. The city's carpenters and labourers were put to work, and for a short period, the anguished, involuntary movements of the afflicted were accompanied by the incongruous sounds of civic-sponsored revelry. Guild halls, such as that of the tanners, were also opened up to accommodate the ever-increasing number of dancers, providing some shelter but also concentrating the phenomenon. This official endorsement of more dancing had predictably a catastrophic effect. Instead of curing the afflicted, the music, the dedicated spaces, and the sheer spectacle of hundreds of people dancing together seemed only to draw more individuals into the vortex. The sensory overload, the rhythmic entrainment, and the heightened emotional atmosphere likely acted as powerful catalysts for those already psychologically vulnerable or suggestible. What was intended as a cure became a potent amplifier of the contagion. As the death toll rose and the situation deteriorated further, with the city's normal functions grinding to a halt, the magistrate recognized the failure of their initial approach. Panic began to set in. The hot blood theory was abandoned, and a new, more desperate strategy was adopted. All public dancing was now strictly prohibited. The musicians were dismissed, the stage dismantled. The authorities, shifting their explanation from the medical to the moral or supernatural, declared that the plague was likely a manifestation of divine anger, or more specifically, a curse invoked by Saint Vitus. Their response now turned to piety and penance. The prevailing belief, actively encouraged by some clergy and embraced by a terrified populace, was that the dancers were under the affliction of Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr known to inflict uncontrollable dancing upon sinners or those who showed him disrespect. Consequently, the city council ordained a series of religious measures. Public prayers and processions were organized, seeking divine mercy. But the most significant intervention involved a forced pilgrimage. The remaining dancers, or at least those still physically capable of being moved and deemed truly afflicted, rather than merely rebellious or attention-seeking, were to be taken to shrines dedicated to Saint Vitus. The primary destination was a grotto in the hills near Saverne, some distance from Strasbourg, which housed a shrine to Saint Vitus. Smaller groups were also reportedly sent to other local shrines, including one at Mount St. Odile. The logistics of this undertaking must have been considerable. The afflicted, many in a state of extreme physical and mental distress, were rounded up. Some chronicles suggest they were bound to prevent escape or further self-harm and transported in wagons. At these shrines, they were subjected to various religious rituals. They were led around the altar, masses were said for them, and they were made to offer gifts and prayers to the saint. Some accounts mention that they were given small crosses and red shoes, blessed by priests, to wear. The symbolism of the red shoes is debated. Some link it to exorcism rituals, others to an attempt to channel or control the frenetic energy. This shift in strategy, from encouraging the dancing to suppressing it and seeking supernatural aid, coincided with the gradual decline of the phenomenon. By early September 1518, roughly 6 weeks after Frau Trophea first began her solitary dance, the intensity of the outbreak began to wane. Fewer new individuals were afflicted, and those who had been dancing for weeks started to slow down, their bodies utterly spent, their minds perhaps slowly emerging from whatever trance-like state had gripped them. Whether the pilgrimages and religious rites had a direct therapeutic effect, perhaps through the power of suggestion and a deeply held belief in their efficacy, or simply by removing individuals from the charged atmosphere of Strasbourg and imposing a new, structured routine, or whether the plague was simply running its natural course, is impossible to say with certainty. The aftermath left Strasbourg shaken. Dozens, possibly more, had perished. Many survivors were left with permanent injuries, chronic pain, or deep psychological scars. Families had been torn apart, and the city's economy and social fabric had been severely disrupted. The dancing plague of 1518 became a dark, infamous chapter in Strasbourg's history, a terrifying memory of a time when the familiar order of life had collapsed into inexplicable, chaotic motion. And while the immediate crisis passed, the question of its cause lingered, a profound enigma that has puzzled observers and scholars for 5 centuries. What, then, could have driven hundreds of people to dance themselves to exhaustion, injury, and even death? Contemporary explanations, as we've seen, vacillated between the medical, the hot blood theory, and the supernatural, divine punishment, or the wrath of Saint Vitus. Astrological influences and other forms of divine or demonic agency were also invoked. But these offer little satisfaction to the modern mind, seeking more empirically grounded understanding. Over time, several key modern theories have emerged, each attempting to shed light on this bizarre episode. One of the most persistent and frequently discussed theories is ergotism, a condition caused by ingesting grains, particularly rye, contaminated with the claviceps purpura fungus, ergot. Rye was a staple food in Alsace, especially for the poorer segments of the population. Ergot produces a range of potent alkaloids, some of which are psychoactive, like lysergic acid, from which LSD is synthesized, and others which cause vasoconstriction. Ergot poisoning can manifest in 2 primary forms: gangrenous ergotism, leading to a burning sensation in the limbs, yogai, Antony's fire, tissue death, and loss of extremities, and convulsive ergotism, characterized by painful muscle spasms, tremors, seizures, mania, psychosis, and hallucinations. Proponents of the ergotism theory point to several factors. The year 1518 followed a period of hardship and famine, and rye grown in damp conditions after a harsh winter and wet spring, conditions potentially present in Alsace, is more susceptible to ergot infestation. Some of the described mental states of the dancers, trance-like, babbling, and their convulsive movements could at a stretch be interpreted as symptoms of convulsive ergotism. However, the case for ergotism as the primary explanation for the Strasbourg dancing plague faces significant challenges. While ergot poisoning can cause involuntary muscle spasms and twitching, it does not typically manifest as sustained, coordinated, rhythmic dancing for days or weeks on end. The highly organized, albeit frenetic nature of the activity described in Strasbourg seems inconsistent with the more chaotic and debilitating motor symptoms of convulsive ergotism. Furthermore, while hallucinations are a feature, the accounts don't strongly emphasize widespread visual or auditory hallucinations among the dancers, focusing more on the compulsion to move. Also, contemporary descriptions lack clear references to the telltale signs of gangrenous ergotism, such as blackened limbs or loss of fingers and toes, which were well-known symptoms of Saint Antony's fire in other recorded outbreaks. While it's possible that some individuals might have been suffering from mild ergot poisoning, which could have exacerbated their psychological distress or suggestibility, it seems unlikely to have been the sole or dominant driver of such a large-scale and specific phenomenon as a dancing plague. Medical historian John Waller, a prominent modern analyst of the event, argues strongly against ergotism, citing the incompatibility of the primary symptoms. This leads to what is currently the most widely accepted theory among many historians and medical experts: mass psychogenic illness, MPI, also known as mass hysteria or collective obsessional behavior. MPI is the rapid spread of illness symptoms through a cohesive social group, where there is no identifiable organic pathogen. It typically occurs in populations under conditions of extreme and prolonged stress. The Strasbourg of 1518 was, as detailed earlier, a crucible of such stress. The cumulative impact of famine, poverty, rampant disease, high mortality rates, and the profound social and religious anxieties of the era created an environment where a collective psychological breakdown was highly plausible. Within this framework, several factors contribute to the MPI explanation. Firstly, the pre-existing cultural belief system was critical. The veneration of Saint Vitus, and the specific belief that he could inflict uncontrollable dancing as a punishment, provided a culturally sanctioned script for the expression of extreme distress. When Frau Trophea began her inexplicable dance, this existing belief system offered an immediate though terrifying framework for understanding it. Secondly, social contagion played a powerful role. In a suggestible and highly stressed population, the sight of others succumbing to the dancing curse could trigger similar symptoms in susceptible individuals. The phenomenon could spread through unconscious imitation, emotional resonance, and the powerful dynamics of group behavior. Thirdly, the initial response of the authorities, legitimizing and even encouraging the dancing by providing music and stages, likely exacerbated the outbreak, reinforcing the idea that this was a genuine affliction that needed to be danced out and drawing more attention and participants to the spectacle. Finally, MPI often provides a usually unconscious form of release or an expression of distress for which there are no other socially acceptable outlets. For people enduring unbearable hardship and lacking any real agency over their lives, succumbing to the dancing plague might have been, paradoxically, a way for their suffering to be publicly acknowledged and for them to temporarily abdicate responsibility for their actions. Historical precedents for dancing manias, though none quite as large or well documented as Strasbourg's, existed in Europe from the 7th to the 17th centuries, often occurring in times of plague, famine, or intense religious fervor. These were sometimes associated with the cult of Saint Vitus or other saints, and involved groups of people dancing erratically for extended periods, often until they collapsed. This historical context lends further credence to the MPI theory, suggesting that the Strasbourg event was an extreme manifestation of a known, though rare, socio-cultural phenomenon. It is also important to consider that the dancing plague of 1518 may not have had a single monolithic cause. It is quite possible, even probable, that it was a multifactorial event. Perhaps a few individuals did suffer from an underlying neurological or physical condition that caused involuntary movements. Others might have been affected by mild food poisoning, like a subclinical dose of ergot, that made them more suggestible. The vast majority, however, were likely caught up in the powerful currents of mass psychogenic illness, their behavior shaped by extreme stress, cultural beliefs, and social contagion. The dancing plague of 1518 thus remains a chilling historical enigma, a window into a world vastly different from our own, yet one that reflects enduring aspects of human psychology and societal response to crisis. It underscores how profoundly mind and body are connected, how cultural narratives can shape physical experience, and how communities under unbearable pressure can manifest their distress in extraordinary and bewildering ways. While we may never know with absolute certainty what precisely compelled Frau Trophea to begin her fateful dance, or what seized the hundreds who followed her, their story serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of order and reason in the face of overwhelming fear, and the mysterious power of the collective human psyche. The echoes of their frantic, ghostly dance still resonate, a bizarre footnote in the annals of human history.